there were two presidents that stood up against doing that, that refused to do it. One was the head of state of Panama, Omar Torrijos, and one was the president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos. And they had a tremendous integrity. And as a result, they both died in private plane crashes.
When we talk about global power and influence, we often think of armies, governments, and even corporations. But there's this whole other layer, one that's just as powerful, maybe even more so, and it operates in the shadows, hidden behind terms like development loans or economic assistance. I'm talking about institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, or the World Bank, and the way these institutions have been weaponized to maintain control over entire nations. On the surface, they sell this narrative about helping the developed world, lifting countries out of poverty, building infrastructure, and fostering growth. It all sounds quite noble, doesn't it? But if you look closer, the story is a lot darker. Because for every road built and every dam they fund, there's a hidden cost. Countries are left with debts they never can repay. And when they can't meet those payments, the IMF, the World Bank, or other institutions come knocking with their demands. Privatize your water, cut social spending, sell off your resources cheap to foreign corporations. That's not aid, it's a trap. And who benefits? Well, one thing is for sure, it's not the people in those countries. It's the same multinational corporations that swoop in to buy up those privatized resources, which are then at bargain prices. Very often it's the Western powers, particularly the United States, that use debt as a leverage to ensure that these nations stay in line economically but also politically. That's what we're here to talk about today, and I can't think of anyone better to guide us through it than John Perkins. He's a man who lived in this world up close and personal. For quite a number of years, he worked as what he called an economic hitman, part of a system that uses promises of prosperity or the threat of economic ruin to get governments and presidents to play by Washington's rule. But then he did something extraordinary. He turned around, walked away, and decided to blow the whistle on this whole system. This puts him in line with a number of other speakers on this channel. What's incredible about John's story is not just what he reveals about how the system works, but how this isn't just some relic of the past. It isn't history, it's happening right now. The debt traps, the structural adjustment programs, the exploitation of natural resources, all of this is still going on today and more in an accelerated pace. And the worst part of this all is that it's not just a coincidence or some unintended consequences. It's by design. So today we are going to dig into all of this. How do the IMF and the World Bank get away with selling themselves as benevolent while doing the exact opposite? How does the US use these institutions to maintain its grip on global power? And here's the big one, what happens to leaders who dare to resist? One last thing. Critical voices, like the ones you hear on this channel, are being actively silenced and suppressed. You may not notice it, you may not know it, you may not even believe it, but it does happen. And I have the statistics to prove it. So if you value sharp, unfiltered analysis that doesn't follow the mainstream narrative, hit subscribe, like and share. It really makes a difference. For those who want to keep up with my work, make sure to join me on Substack. No restricting algorithmic filters there. And of course, you can listen to all episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon. All links are in the description below. Thank you. John Perkins, pleasure having you. How are you?
I'm great. It's good to be with you, Thomas.
Likewise. Now, I dug into my private library and I found a book that I read, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe at least 20 years ago. I can't believe it myself, yeah, but it must be 20 years ago. And I can prove it because the pages are already pretty yellow, right? So, very briefly, Economic Hitman, John Perkins, in a nutshell, tell us.
Well, let me just tell you that there've been two updates since then.
I know,
The
you have a
most
trilogy.
goes
Yes.
to China, which I think is the most important one, actually.
Okay.
But um, Yeah, so I was an economic hitman back in the 1970s. My official title was chief economist at a major US consulting firm, but my job was to identify countries that had resources our corporations wanted, like oil, for example, and then arrange a huge loan to those countries. But the money didn't actually ever go to the countries. It had to be used to hire our corporations, big engineering corporations, to build infrastructure projects like electric power grids and highways and ports, airports and industrial parks, things that really benefited our companies, first of all, because they made huge profits, but also a few wealthy families in those countries that owned the industries, owned the businesses that benefited from better roads, better electricity, more stable electricity, and so on and so forth. And so what we call this economic hitman because it was really a hit that in the end the countries couldn't repay their loans. And so the collateral was their resource, oil, or today likely to be copper, cobalt, lithium, gold, the things that are used in the high-tech industry, as well as oil and other minerals. And so when the country couldn't repay its loans, we'd go back and say, hey, so okay, you got to give your collateral, your oil, real cheap to our corporations without environmental or social regulations, or vote with us on the next U.S. vote, the next United Nations vote against Cuba or whatever. Let us build a military base on your soil. You know, we were really building an empire, an economic empire around the world through this whole process. So it really was a hit.
In my recollection, and again, as I said, it's about 20 years ago that I read this book. Yeah, in my recollection, I had the impression you worked for the CIA, but meanwhile, I did some research and I saw a couple of other interviews that you did. That was actually not the case. You worked in a private company, right?
Correct. I was recruited by the National Security Agency, the NSA, which is similar to the CIA, but it primarily deals in communications and cryptology and so on. And I was recruited by them, but rather than accepting that job immediately, I went into the Peace Corps, a an American organization that sends young people, well, today it's all kinds of people abroad, and they sent me to the Amazon. I spent 3 years in Ecuador, mostly in the Amazon. And when I came back, I was recruited by this consulting firm. And as it turned out, this consulting firm had very close ties with the U.S. intelligence community. That's a common practice amongst some of the corporations in the United States and the agencies. They help each other. There's no official connection, but they help each other. And so I was never hired by the CIA or the NSA, never paid by them. I worked for a private corporation. We had contracts with the U.S. State Department, the Treasury Department, USAID, the World Bank, the International, and the IMF, and so on. Those are the contracts with our company. The company paid me a salary, but a lot of our work was promoting this policy that I've just described in what we today know as a debt trap policy.
And you had, I forgot the exact number, 100, what, 180 people working for you in this company?
Well, in the company, there were 2,000 professionals. I had as many as 50 people working for me at different times. I was chief economist. The company was primarily engineering, but we had a whole economic sector that the engineers totally depended upon. Our job was key because we were the ones who went in and did the studies and determined where to invest this money. So the World Bank would essentially come to us and say, hey, you know, Ecuador is a very poor country. We want, and they've got a lot of oil, incidentally. We want to help them. And so we want to invest, I don't know, a couple of $1 billion in today's terms in that country. You go in and tell us what the most efficient way to invest that will come back and help our corporations have big contracts, but also help the GDP, the gross domestic product, to grow. So my job was to go in and write reports and convince the leadership of that country, the president or whoever, that they should accept these huge loans that they knew were going to put their country deep into debt, and that the collateral would be their resources. But they had these reports that really justified the taking the loans because it showed that GDP would grow, that the country would be better off.
As a matter of coincidence, I'm rereading Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, which I also read like 20 years ago. I don't know, yeah. And he describes in his book two countries that you also describe, and that's El Salvador and Guatemala, right? If you take those two countries as an example, yeah. So in El Salvador, the U.S. economic strategies went really hand to hand with this brutal military support that America gave to this, how shall we call it, junta. So how did debt traps amplify the social inequalities and prolong that specific civil conflict, which cost, I don't know how many tens of thousands of lives? One notable was, what was his name? Archbishop Romero. By
Yeah,
the way, this was before your time, right?
yes.
Yeah.
But but Guatemala was during my time, and I go to Guatemala every year now. I take groups. I work with the Mayan people, and I take groups to learn from the Mayan people every year. And any of your listeners are welcome to go. Just check out my website. Um, and
Maybe we should mention it, johnperkins.org.
Thank you. And so Guatemala and El Salvador, but let's talk about Guatemala because that's more recent. There was a civil war there that didn't end until 1996. It lasted for about 30 years. That was really a war of genocide against the Mayan people by the half dozen families that control the country of Guatemala and have essentially ever since the Spanish conquest. So these are very, very powerful families, and they're very strongly aligned with U.S. corporations. Most all of the bananas in the United States and many other agricultural products come through that channel. They come in through U.S. corporations, and they're grown by these families in Guatemala. And so there's this tight relationship between the U.S. government and the oligarchs, this handful of families that ran Guatemala against the Mayan people. And it was a devastating war. It was a war of genocide. Ultimately, the Mayans came out on top pretty well. It was an incredible story of heroism and perseverance on the part of the Mayan people. It's one of the reasons I now work with them because they have so much to teach the world about persistence and about doing the right thing and sticking to it, being committed. And so I don't know whether that answers your question, but there was just this close relationship between U.S. corporations, the U.S. government, and the oligarchy government of Guatemala, and also El Salvador, and many other countries. The Shah of Iran, another client of mine, was very closely tied to this. Pinochet, the terrible, horrible, brutal dictator of Chile, and on and on. There's so many examples of this, Thomas. It's you know, it's a very black eye in American history, and it's one of the reasons that I write about it and talk about it because I think, as a loyal American and someone who believes in democracy, I know that we have to expose our dark side. We have to talk about the mistakes we've made so that we can improve and not make those mistakes again.
I have prepared a list of a number of countries, and I'm bringing this now in because you already mentioned a couple of those countries on that list. But maybe we could go through this list just as a backdrop, highlighting American history. And again, this is not American bashing or whatever. I mean, I'm a European. I don't have any stake in this game, right? But I think it's really important because I find it as an outsider looking into America, I find it sometimes extremely, how shall I say this? Puzzling how little Americans are aware about their own history. So I mean, even the young ones, or especially the young ones, right? There are plenty of those clips on social media where questions like, against whom did America fight the War of Independence? And the people are really struggling. Canada, you know, it's just amazing. So that's where work like yours comes really in for those who are interested, for those who have eyes to see. So the first country on the list here is Congo in 1961, Patrick Lumumba. Can you tell us anything about that?
Well, I was never involved in the Congress, so I can't.
I'm not saying, yeah, but
But what I'm saying is I can't speak from personal experience. But
yeah,
Lumumba was taken down, and I have no doubt that the CIA and other U.S. agencies were involved in that. But as to the details, because I wasn't there, I don't like to speculate, Thomas. I love to talk
okay,
about this where I actually worked.
yeah, but it's worth highlighting that he was actually assassinated. That the consequences for Congo were dramatic,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Um,
yes, and there's little doubt in my mind that that the U.S. was deeply involved in that assassination in one way or another. And I mean, it's a good. You look at Africa. You're Dutch, am I correct?
yeah,
Yeah, quite a history there too that goes back a lot further.
yes.
But the colonialistic period that the Americans have been doing recently, and now the Chinese are excelling at, it goes back to so many of the European countries, Holland and France and England and Germany, and it's an age old. It's we call it a game as old as empire, and it is.
Colonialization, you're absolutely right. And people mostly believe that this is something from the past. But you mentioned it already. Um, IMF and the World Bank. Would it be a fair statement to say these are just the modern tools we use to colonize in a different form, but to colonize, you know, the third world basically?
Yes, absolutely. We are in the we have been during most of my lifetime in the process of enslaving countries through debt. So it's very different from going into the jungles and bringing people out in chains and putting them on ships, and sending them across the Atlantic, what was done during the slave trade or up into Europe. But it's still slavery, but it's debt slavery. And it's very insidious. It's done in a way that makes it look good. So when these countries take on this debt, you can show through econometric models, through statistics, that as you invest in power plants and industrial parks and so on, the GDP, the gross domestic product, that general measurement of the economy that's pretty much accepted around the world, increases. It does. And I believed in the system that I was promoting for many years. But then I began to see that GDP is not an accurate measure of prosperity. It measures how well the rich are doing and big corporations. It does not measure how well the overall population is doing. And so part of this game is using statistics to prove something that looks very good, but ultimately it's a shadow. It's a scam. The GDP is not a good measure of general prosperity. And even worse is GDP per capita. So when you see that number, oh, this will increase GDP per capita by 5% a year. You say, oh my God, everybody's per capita. That means everybody. We're all going to get better. But the fact is, GDP per capita is just GDP divided by the number of people. And the GDP is generated by the very wealthy and the big corporations, and they're the ones who benefit. Those people that are included in that statistic, in many instances, actually suffer from these policies because money is diverted from education, healthcare, and other social services that would help the average person or the lower income people. That money is diverted into paying interest on the loans.
I heard you talk about hmm, shall we talk about you first and then more general? Because I'm sure this is going on today in a different form, but it's still ongoing. Yeah, IMF and the World Bank still exist. But from your perspective, and I heard you say you did this for about 10 years. So where then was there never pushback? And what happened if there was pushback
Pushback from whom?
from the countries, from the president, for example, or
Oh yeah, well, because the president benefits, and the people. So my job was really pretty easy because I would go in and say, "Hey, in this hand, I've got a few $1 billion that your country's going to invest in infrastructure. Your family and all of your friends own industries because usually the presidents are part of the elite. You own the businesses. and they're going to benefit from more stable electricity, from better highways, from better ports. You and your family are going to benefit from all of this. And incidentally, if you hire us to do this, if you sign the contract, we'll see to it that all of your children and your friends' children and your family's children get scholarships to go to United States colleges. We'll give them the scholarships. My firm was located in Boston. We say Boston has a lot of really good universities, MIT, Harvard, Boston University, so on and so forth. We have good connections. We'll get your kids into those colleges. We'll give them full scholarships, and we'll give them jobs during vacations and when they get out of school. Now that's worth a tremendous amount of money, especially to people in some of these other countries. And we'd brag about it. It was really a bribe, but because it's legal, it's not legally a bribe. And we'd brag about it. We tell them the Boston Globe, the big newspaper, well, we invested, we gave several $1 million last year to these countries in Africa and Latin America so their kids could go to college here. And we wouldn't bother to say we gave the money to the families that needed it the least. But so the family, the heads of state and ministers of finance and all the others, we'd say, look, in this hand we got all this money that's going to really help you, or in this hand I got a gun. Now I didn't actually carry a gun, but these presidents knew about Lumumba. They knew about Allende of Chile and Arbenz of Guatemala and the Shah and Mossadegh of Iran and the Diem of Vietnam and on and on. And so they knew that behind me stood the people we call jackals, that if they didn't sign these deals, they were likely to be overthrown in coups or even assassinated. There's a long history of that, unfortunately. So, as I said, it made my job pretty easy. Here's a lot of money, or here's a gun.
Yeah, you said mostly the presidents are aligned with, let's say, the elite of the country. That's for some countries that's true. For other countries, of course, for example, Allende, you just mentioned him, or Mossadegh, they're taken out. Yeah,
Yeah,
and a really interesting example. And again, I'm sometimes surprised. Americans do not know why there's so strong resistance from Iran against America, and the reason is because they don't know the history.
yeah,
The grandson of President Roosevelt, Kermit Roosevelt, I have his biography somewhere behind me, was bragging in his biography how they instigated the coup against a moderate teacher. Yeah, that's what actually what he was. Yeah, as a consequence, they installed the Shah Reza Pahlavi, which had reigned one of the most repressive regimes on this planet. Nobody knows how many people died.
correct.
So those are the very tangible consequences of foreign interference. And we suffer today. This is not gone. The situation today has its roots in the past. That's very
Exactly.
easy to overlook. From all those countries, which stuck out to you most?
Which ones stood up to me?
All those countries that you are aware of. I mean, we can continue on my list, yeah, but where the US or the West, let's just say it this way, was involved in either regime change or, in the strategy that you have outlined as economic hitman.
If you name a country that has significant resources that are needed by modern industry, it was probably on the list.
Yeah, but for you personally, because I
Me
mean,
personally, well, the ones, Indonesia, Iran, as you mentioned, a lot of countries in Latin America, but there were, and almost everyone went along with the deal. They played the game that I wanted them to play ultimately. And there were two presidents that stood up against doing that, that refused to do it. One was the head of state of Panama, Omar Torrijos, and one was the president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos. And they had a tremendous integrity. They would not play this game. And it was Torrijos actually who helped me understand that what I was doing was I was lying to the world and myself, that that this whole system was not helping the majority of the people. It was just helping the rich get richer. And Torrijos helped me understand that. So both of these men refused to play the deal, the game, and as a result, they both died in private plane crashes. That most of the world, including me, I suspect beyond a doubt that they were assassinations. There's never been a smoking gun. We can't prove it. If you want to kill someone, Thomas, take down their private plane because the smoking gun goes down with the plane. It burns up with the plane. So those deaths have never been proven to have been assassinations.
Yeah. Yeah. So Torrijos was killed in 1981. Why? Because he wanted to have control over the Panama Canal. And Ecuador, 1981, Jimmy Roldos, he wanted to have the oil revenue for his own country, right?
Correct. And Torrijos went beyond that. So he negotiated the Canal Treaty with Jimmy Carter, President of the United States, and won. He got the canal to be turned over to Panamanians. But he was looked at as a hero throughout the world because Panama was not a significant country economically. It did have the canal, but this guy stood up to the giant. So he was considered like a David standing up to Goliath, the United States. And he was considered a model. He was a hero in so many countries. And other leaders would be tempted to follow him. And so one of the reasons he was taken out was because you couldn't have this guy continue to be seen as a hero, as a model for other leaders in other countries. And in fact, when you take a president like that out, or both of them, and they both happened within 3 months of each other, Roldos and Torrijos, when that happens, leaders around the world know that they better be damn careful. They better play the game. I mean, it's a very strong warning to these countries. So there's the ostensible reason why you take them out, but there's the story behind the story, which is it sends a very strong message across the world.
Who else did you meet personally? Did you meet personally, talk to personally? Which presidents from which countries?
Well, there was the Shah of Iran. I worked closely with the Shah of Iran. There was a royal family in Saudi Arabia. There was the president of Indonesia. Um, Colombia, Argentina. Often, this might be a handshake with the president, and then you'd meet with the minister of finance or somebody else that represented the president. Sometimes, as in the case of Torrijos, I got to know him very well personally. He was extremely charismatic. He loved parties. He loved big barbecues. He loved his rum and his cigars and his women and partying. And he invited me to a lot of these parties, and I would spend time with him personally. And so he was a guy that really helped me understand how insidious and how dangerous the system was. So for the first 7 years I was an economic hitman, I believed in what I was doing. I thought I was doing the right thing. Thought I was helping, GDP per capita. I must be helping the people. And after about 7 years is when Torrijos got to me and several other people also, but he was instrumental. And so I stayed in the business for the next 3 years because it was very difficult to get out. And I didn't really want to get out. I didn't want to believe, Tomas, that I knew what I knew because I was making a lot of money. I come from a relatively poor teacher's family in rural New Hampshire. And suddenly I'm flying first class around the world, staying in the best hotels, wining and dining with presidents. I was in denial. And I think that says a lot about what many people today that continue this kind of system. And now the Chinese have become extremely good at doing what we did, at doing, continue, we continue to do it. They do it a lot better though, a lot more efficiently, let's say. And I think so many people, whether you're from China or from the United States or from Holland or wherever you're from, people who do these kinds of exploitations, these hits, often are convinced that they believe that they do the right thing. And when they see that they're not, if they see that they're not, they have a hard time giving it up.
Where was for you the epiphany? Where was for you this wake up call that showed you you can't continue like this?
Well, so there was Torrijos buzzing in one ear telling me that what I was doing was wrong. And I was also I was dating a young woman in Colombia, a Colombian woman, and she didn't speak any English. I speak Spanish, and but she had a brother who was a member of what became FARC, one of the what we today consider a terrorist organization. In those days, those organizations were really representing the people, and they were supported by the Soviet Union financially. When the Soviet Union collapsed or when it stopped its financial support, they then turned much more to extortion and drugs and other activities that we know of today as terrorists. But so her name was Paula, and she really helped me understand this too. She saw the other side very clearly. The epiphany. So I'm going through this process. My conscious is now struggling with itself. Like, oh my God, I know what I'm doing is wrong. Well, but maybe it isn't wrong. You know, all the statistics say it isn't wrong. The human resources department of my company says I'm doing a good thing. The World Bank says I'm doing a good thing. The universities, business schools say I'm doing a good thing. So, okay, I know I'm not doing a good thing, but I'm making a lot of money. So, and I can convince myself. And then I went, I rented a small sailboat in the Virgin Islands took a vacation. And one night I anchored off the island of St. John, and I rowed the dinghy ashore, and I climbed up on this hill, this mountain, sort of small mountain, with a plantation, ruins of a sugar plantation at the top. And I sat there in this beautiful setting, you know, bougainvillea growing over the ruins of the sugar plantation, looking out at the sun setting over the Caribbean. And I thought, my God, this is so idyllic. And then it occurred to me that this whole plantation was built on the bones of thousands of slaves from Africa. And then I had to confront the fact that the whole hemisphere, the Americas, are all built on the bones of slaves, not only from Africa, but from our own countries too. And then I had to admit that I too was a slaver, but I slaved people with debt. And at that moment, I got very angry with myself, and I committed to never doing it anymore. I went back to my headquarters in Boston, went into the president's office at the end of the vacation, and quit.
I think this is also one of the aspects that make you, in lack of a better term, special, because you went through this paradigm shift, and this shift put your life upside down. I have a number of speakers on my channel. The most recent one was Hala Huarid. She was a 18-year-long diplomat for the US, and she quit based on the fact that she could not agree with herself Biden's policy towards Gaza. And she described similar things, you know. I mean, she was so, I mean, the life of a diplomat. You live in diplomatic housing, you have diplomatic passports, your children go into diplomatic schools, the number plates on your cars, everything, yeah. Not to mention all your, you know, the social environment. Yeah.
Yeah,
So it's I could imagine that's similar also from your social environment after quitting.
yeah. I had pretty much an unlimited expense account for me and my department. I could travel anywhere in the world I wanted to, first class. And, you know, I didn't really have to have a good excuse. As I mentioned, I had a girlfriend in Colombia. I could fly down to Colombia basically anytime I wanted and spend time with her. And then while I was there, I would meet with some, you know, some official or somebody to justify the trip. But yeah, I was living the American dream. But at some point, and I realized, and this happened when I was up on that hill in St. John also, but I'd already begun to see that even though I seemed to be living the American dream, I was I was living it on a lot of alcohol and Valium. I'd travel off to fly to someplace that was 11 and 12 time zones away and have to meet with people and sign big contracts. And I would be taking Valium and lots of alcohol at night so I could sleep. And then the next morning I'd fill myself with caffeine. And I began to realize, wow, is this the American dream? If it is, maybe I don't want it anymore. And then I have this epiphany on this mountain, and it all kind of came together at that point. But yeah, you know, so many of us, I suspect every one of your listeners is doing something that they know they really shouldn't be doing, but they're doing it anyway. Maybe driving a car a little too frequently, or flying off on vacations in you know, using jet fuel, and they say, well, geez, I'm you know I'm helping to contribute to climate change. I'm like, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Maybe I should be taking a bicycle vacation instead. Uh, but we do these things, and it's part of human nature, and we find many ways to justify it. But Tommaso, one of the things I've learned over time is it's all a matter of perception. Reality is molded by perception. And when we have like I had a perception that I was living the American dream, but suddenly I saw a different perception that I was not happy. I was miserable. And that gave me a new perception of what I needed to do with the rest of my life, which was get out of this job and use what I knew and know about the system to try to change it.
Couple of things. We will talk about China, but before we do, if you look with your experience to what's going on today, let's say in the last, I don't want to go too far back, let's say the last 10 years or so. If you look and you analyze the situation with the experience and knowledge that you have, where do you see this kind of economic hitman strategies being applied today, let's say in the last, like the last 10 years?
Yeah. So I mentioned there's been three, Confessions of an Economic Hitman is really a trilogy. And the first one that came out in 2004 was about what we've discussed, which I consider really generic. So I go off and arrange these loans, and I wanted American companies to be hired, but I really didn't care whether the construction company that was hired was Bechtel or Halliburton or Stone and Webster, as long as my company got a small piece of the deal. We didn't do construction; we did engineering, design, and management. But then something happened that this system was so successful that the economic hitman began to hit everybody, people in Europe, people in the United States. And this is really the second wave, and it's the second book in the series that talks about how every major corporation has its form of economic hitman. And they'll go to a country like, let's say, uh, let's just say Nike wants to build a factory in Asia. So their economic hitmen will go to the Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia and try to see with whom they can strike the best deal. Who's going to make us pay the least taxes? Who's going to give us the least environmental and social regulations? Who's going to have the lowest wages? And they'll go in and negotiate. So in addition to people still doing the kind of thing that I did with the World Bank and the IMF, now every major corporation has their hitmen. And they've reached a general population, at least in the United States, where we have incredible debt, student debt, and students get out of, I have a good, I was talking to a young lady the other day who just got out of law school. She went to law school because she wanted to become an environmental lawyer. But she said when she got out of law school, she had $200,000 in debt. That being an environmental lawyer wasn't going to pay off. And so she went to work for a big law firm where she could make that money to pay off her debt. And she said, well, in 5 years, I'll have the debt paid off and then I can do what I want to do. And I said, yeah, but what happens if you fall in love and get married and have a baby and buy a house? You're going to be deeper and deeper into debt. So the system expanded. And now the third wave of economic hitmen, which is this book that came out a little over a year ago, is about how China has, taken our model and improved on it. And they've learned from our successes and our failures. I taught at a Chinese MBA program in Shanghai a few years back. And I very quickly discovered that what these young students wanted to learn was what I did that I figured was a success and what I did I figured was wrong so they could get better. And since the year 2000, in the year 2000, the United States was the number one trading partner with about 80% of the world's countries. That's reversed itself. Today, China is a major world trader all over the world, in every continent, including Europe, including even North America to a large degree. So we've seen China's economic hitmen just really, really rise during the last couple of decades.
There's some that argue that the Chinese did it a little bit different.
They do. Um, for one thing, they have a really good story to tell. They can go in and say, "Hey, listen, We brought 900 million people out of dire poverty in a few years. That's more than twice the population of the United States. Our economy grew by an average of 10% a year for 30 years. Nobody else has ever done anything like that. Hey, Mexico. Hey, Congo. Which model do you want? The United States, meanwhile, it's gone from 60% of its people being in the middle class to 50%. It has the same federal minimum wage today that it had in 1973. The minimum wage, people are worse off today if they get a minimum wage than they were back in the 70s. So they have this incredible story to tell to the world. And they also say, we will not get involved in politics in your country. We haven't ever assassinated any leaders. We haven't overthrown any governments. Oh, you might mention, Tibet and the few areas. Maybe we're struggling with Taiwan and parts that connect us with India, but that's part of the family. And they'd say to an American, "Look what you did with Mexico. You took over about half of Mexico now. It's Texas and California and some of the other states." That's how it is with us in this local area. We claim these lands, but we haven't sent troops into Africa or Latin America. We haven't assassinated any leaders. We don't try to dictate policies in these countries. And all of that has a very appealing story to these countries. And yet, in the end, what China's trying to do is exactly the same thing. Take the resources. The debt trap is alive and well with Chinese economic hitmen.
Again, some would argue Chinese does it a little bit different because, for example, if you talk about Chile and the Chicago model, the shock doctrine that Pinochet tried to impose based on the instructions that he got and bitterly failed. This is not something that China does, right?
Correct. Yes, China
Which
has.
makes it much more attractive for countries to follow the Chinese model than the US-led model.
Yes, and it hasn't built military bases in other countries.
They've won in Djibouti. China has one military base in Djibouti. America has 750 that are recognized. So yeah, and another 150, those secret military bases. And for people, if you look into this, a military base, what is a military base? Well, Okinawa, 50,000 people. This is a city. Yeah,
Yeah,
America is a highly, highly militarized society, and people don't realize it. We all don't realize it. Yeah.
right. And even the Chinese base in Djibouti is justified in that it's primarily, it's set up as a refueling base for ships that have to go around Africa and through the Indian Ocean. So, yeah, yeah, I mean, it's huge. And, it's interesting, Thomas, because China's also made a lot of huge mistakes. Their construction is often shoddy. They built a huge dam in Ecuador that is built on a fault line, earthquake fault line next to an active volcano. They've done a lot of shoddy engineering. And in this new book, I talk about this. They say they're on a learning curve. And I'm quite critical of China, as well as pointing out its successes. And just this last week, I received this. It's the cover of my last book on China that's being published in China by a major publishing house that published my two previous books. When we wrote this book, when I wrote this book, my publisher and I both agreed that probably China would not publish it, but not print it because it has so much that's negative about China. We thought it might be printed in Taiwan and in Chinese language, and now it's being published. And as I understand it from a Chinese friend, it's essentially no censorship. And that's, it's interesting because many Americans are led to believe that the Chinese can't get any information that's negative to their country. I don't know what the truth behind all of that is, but I will say that my book has got a lot of truth that is negative about China, and it's now being published by a major house in China.
The truth is that China is a collectivist society and America is an individualist society, which is a total different system. Yeah? In China, you don't have patents. China wants people, and companies to build on what was achieved before. That's unthinkable in America, where America even puts patents on planes.
Right.
Anyway, those are two different approaches. I hope you have success with your book. I definitely will get at least the last one. So then I have the first one and the last one. I didn't know before I started to do some research for this interview that there were two other books, and you also wrote a novel.
Well, it's not, it's coming out in February, I think. Yes. And incidentally, if people sign up for my newsletter, go if at my website, there's a little box, you put in your email address, you get a newsletter once a month, pretty short. I don't overwhelm people at all. But everybody who's signed up for that will get the first chapter of my book digitally free. And then for a pretty low price of under $10, they can buy the rest of the book if they like the first chapter. Yes, it's a novel and it deals with some of the same ideas and subjects. It takes place in Guatemala, and I think it's a lot of fun. I've had had a lot of fun writing it. You know what's interesting? The great British writer Graham Greene once told me, I had breakfast with him one time in Panama, and he told me, I write nonfiction for the most part because you can tell the truth in nonfiction that you can't tell. You tell the truth in, sorry, he said, I write fiction for the most part because you can tell the truth better in fiction than you can in nonfiction. And there's a lot of wisdom in that because I don't write anything in my nonfiction books that I don't have backup material for, which is fortunate because Bechtel Corporation and others tried to sue me for what I wrote and what I've written about them. But I have the backup information that proves that what I'm saying is out there in the public knowledge and that they can't, so therefore sue me for it. Uh, so there's a lot of things that I know that I haven't written about because I don't have backup information. And in a novel, I can write about things that I know, but I don't have the backup information.
That struck me about your website, which I have open here next to me, because it's how shall I say this? It's a mixture between almost kind of spiritual stuff, like an exciting announcement, a message from the Pleiades, next to corporate hitmen colonizing America, next to post-election advice from a troll. Yeah, so the topics that and then JFK, a message to a nation in crisis. What is here? A Tale of Two Cats, One Castle and the Golden Rule. It's a bit a mixture. That
Yeah,
means your topics are quite broad. Then we have Latin America, violence and possibilities. So what's the focus of your? I mean, for yourself, not on your blog. What's the focus of your interest? The focus of your attention?
changing the world. Making the transition from what economists call a death economy, an economic system that's based on maximizing materialistic consumption and short-term profits for corporations, and that is consuming and polluting itself toward destruction, transforming that into a life economy that pays people to clean up pollution, to come up with technologies that corral all the plastic in the oceans, and recycle, that rejuvenate destroyed environments, recycle, create new technologies that can pull energy out of the air or water. And there's all kinds of possibilities here for what we call a life economy. And that's the ultimate goal that I have is always keeping my grandson in mind and all of his brothers and sisters across the planet. What can we do to stop this trajectory that we're on that's ultimately destructive to us and a lot of the planet? Um, and so I've written 5 books on indigenous cultures, shamanism. Uh, and those were the books I wrote before Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I spent a lot of time in the Amazon. I just came from there in August. I'm going again in January. I take small groups to learn from the indigenous people there who do have a life economy. And So that was the first 5 books. And then I wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And there have been 5 books since then about global economics, including the 3 in the trilogy and 2 others. And then there's another book called Touching the Jaguar, which tries to make the bridge between the two. Because for me, they all come to the same, they all come out with the same conclusion as to what happens in the world. And that is that reality is molded by perception. And so that's shamanism, but that's also uh, modern psychoanalysis. That, there is no Holland, there's no United States, there's no religion, there's no culture, there's no corporations until we perceive them. And when enough people have a perception like that and take actions that codify it, or then it changes reality. And so we're living in this reality today that's based on this idea of materialistic consumption, and that the success stories are those people who make the most money, who have the most goods, and that corporations have to maximize long-term profits. I believe that businesses have to make profits, but they don't have to maximize short-term profits. They don't need to maximize short-term profits. They can put some of that money to paying their workers a fair wage, investing in insurance plans and pensions, and also investing in local communities where their businesses operate, building schools or recreational facilities, or libraries, whatever. Uh, and so, we're at this cusp in human history where more and more people around the world are waking up to the fact that we can't continue. The oceans are melting. The oceans are rising. It's a little early here where I am. For me, the oceans are rising. The glaciers are melting. There's more droughts. There's more fires. It's more floods. We're waking up to that around the world. But now it's time to really move into this new perception of what it means to truly be humans. And this idea of perceptions molding reality is what marketing is all based on, what politics is based on. Essentially, all of human activities revolve around how we perceive things. And that's shamanism. So the 5 books on indigenous people and shamanism go into that. So do the books on global economics. And so that other book, Touching the Jaguar, is one that's meant to form the bridge to explain to people how these two work. It's not that it's necessary to read that in order to understand what economic hitmen do, but in that third book of the trilogy on economic hitmen, I really go into how we need to use this time to change our perception and transform the death economy to a life economy.
I fully agree. I think we are on very thin ice, so to speak. And with the point of view that you just outlined, is it not a little bit depressing sometimes, seeing what's really going on? I mean, at the moment, I mean, my channel focuses basically on mostly two things: the conflict in Gaza and the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm flipping between which one is more dangerous. Now, at the moment, it's again Russia, after having deployed the first ever hypersonic, intercontinental rocket. And I saw actually the images. It comes like the fingers of God, those split warheads. Incredible, incredible footage.
Yeah.
So if you take this into consideration, and I mean, you talked about plastic, and I'm flipping now, but there's a connection here. There is a sea of plastic the size of Texas in the ocean. People don't realize this is massive. The impact on the wildlife. This stuff grinds itself to smaller and smaller pieces. All of us, you, me, everybody has microplastics in their system already. If you think about this self-destructive capitalism, yeah, more and more and more, there is a dead end. There is virtually a dead end, yeah, to this whole system. But coming back to Russia, for example, we could also go the other line into Gaza or Israel, yeah. With Syria, just yesterday, Damascus, yeah, Assad fell. So if you include these kind of things, these happenings, these massive, massive changes that are happening on several fronts, two of which we just discussed, but at this very moment, there are 55 hot, active wars going on this little planet of ours. My screensaver here, I have a big screen here, is the blue planet. Um,
Yeah.
so where does this leave you, you know, with your thoughts and with your concerns or with your research even? Seen that we, I mean, just
Well,
this morning I watched one last thing. I watched the interview with Tucker Carlson and Lavrov, where they talk, and Lavrov is one of the best politicians out there. It's not That's not what I'm saying. Yeah? Most experienced, whatever. He hints at nuclear, that there's the possibility of nuclear exchange. Not necessarily from Russia, because we know from American functionaries, politicians, they openly discuss a potential first strike on Russia and how to justify it. NATO stuff, yeah, NATO generals discuss the same thing. A first strike might be, what was the word they're using? Justified or something. I'm not entirely sure. To protect, NATO and the West. Yeah, if you take these kind of things into consideration, where does it leave you?
well, Thomas, I think what you've just described, as well as the global economic inequality, the climate change, these are all, and the wars, these are all symptoms. They're not the problem. They are problems. But the problem is the death economy. And that's behind all of this. Wars are fought primarily for economic reasons or to gain more power, but there's that economic drive behind it. There's this death economy, is what's driving all of these things. And it's a perception. It's a perception of them versus us. It's leaders who feel that they have to have an enemy in order to stay in power. Netanyahu, if he doesn't stay in power, he's
You're
probably going
going
to
to jail. You're
he's
going to jail.
and so we want his motive. But there's also the whole economic drive behind that. That the United States defends Israel because it's the fortress. It's the U.S.'s fortress in the Middle East, basically. Russia defended Syria for a similar type of reason, although it wasn't a stronger relationship. Uh, and all of this is driven by oil, by the resources of the Middle East, by the populations there, the workforces and the consumers there. So I see that what all of this amounts to is we must change the perception that has created a death economy. This idea of materialistic consumption, maximizing materialistic consumption, maximizing short-term profits for big corporations. It's regardless of the social and environmental costs. This is what's driving so many of these crises that we're currently facing. And what gives me hope is that we're on the cusp. As I travel around the world, I just came back last week from Qatar. I was speaking on Al Jazeera TV in Qatar. They flew me over to Qatar, me and my wife, to, for an hour and a half interview, which was rather shocking. But anyway, because I thought we can do it by Zoom, right? But they wanted me there. Anyway, and I just came back from Latin America. I'm headed there again. I spent a lot of last summer in Europe speaking and all over in China, and everywhere I go, I see that people are listening. They're waking up. They're listening to your show. They're they're waking up. They're talking about these things, and that's the first step. The next step is to understand that we can change that perception that's driving us toward destruction. And then we understand that we can take actions that go along with it. We can actually create companies that corral that island of plastic out there that's the size of Texas and reuse it. We can create technologies that produce energy in a different way, and we can recycle copper and cobalt and gold. We don't need to keep digging it up. So people are getting it, and that gives me hope. At the same time, the status quo pushes back. This has been true throughout history. When there's a revolution, and we're in a revolution, it's a consciousness revolution. Whenever there's a revolution, there's pushback by the status quo who think they've got it made the way it is. And we need to take strength from that pushback. I've been a martial artist most of my life, and I know that if I'm up against a guy who's bigger and stronger than me, I don't try to overpower him. I have to use his energy against him. And I think today what we need to look at is that the status quo is pushing back, and they have a lot of power. They have a lot of money. We need to turn that around. That's what I hope to do. That, I mean, I'm not and I don't kid myself that I'm going to, be the driving force behind this, just one voice among many include yours, that we need to turn this around. I think, and as I guess it's kind of a final word here, I'd like to say that I would like to get listeners all to know that, to feel that they are blessed to live at this time in history. It's crucial. Human species is evolving, and we all have a part to play in that. It's a time of incredible crises and amazing opportunities. We have the opportunity here to evolve, to look at what it truly means to be human, being human, to be human beings, being human on this planet, and to redefine what success means for us. It's a great time to be alive and doing this kind of work that we do, that you do, that I do, that everybody who listens is involved in one way or another.
I don't have anything to add to those words. Very fitting to end on that note, John. It was my pleasure talking to you. You will hear from me again, I promise.
Well, thanks, Thomas. And remember, johnperkins.org.
I will put a link in the description of this interview.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you
Yes.
for all you do. I really appreciate the fact that you're having so many people speak out. That's so important. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. It really makes a difference. And as said at the beginning, if you want to keep up with my work, make sure you subscribe on Substack too. In my Substack newsletter, I dig even deeper. I break down tricky ideas, show you practical analytical techniques, and I explain you how you can use them in your own life. It's free, the link's right below, and I would love for you to join the conversation. Let me know how it's changing the way you look at the world and its people. As always, thanks for your support and see you next time.